Ladies and gentlemen, it's Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran, and today we are going deep into weird military lore. That's right, this is Popo Medic's mini doc on Army Rangers smoking some Crips in 1989. This is a blast from the past, so let's get into it.
Saturday, September 23rd.
But more importantly, we're going to talk about just the universe of weird military lore that a lot of civilians just don't understand how weird the military can get.
1989. An Army Ranger who had just purchased a home on one of Tacoma, Washington's most gang-infested streets quickly became a witness to various illegal activity happening out front of his home. He wasn't shy of confronting it or notifying the authorities, and soon after, he became the target of one of the most notorious street gangs Washington State has ever seen.
So if you guys, I don't know if he's going to set the stage here. I kind of hope he does. But if not, the early 90s and late 80s were economically some of the worst times that the country's seen in modern history, right? Before the dot-com bubble burst, right, in 2001, a decade prior, the economy was also tanking. It tanked so bad, in fact, that the sitting U.S. president, George H.W. Bush, despite having won a massive victory in Iraq, yes, the U.S. military did use to win wars decisively, he still managed to lose re-election because of how bad the economy had just imploded. And predictably, it coincided with the rise in crack cocaine. So in the 70s, cocaine was an expensive party drug that was the purview primarily of young professionals who could afford the expensive party drug. But in the 80s, someone developed a way to efficiently increase the potency of cocaine so that a little bit of cocaine could be used and distributed to a lot of people and still get them reliably and convincingly high. This meant that their target demographic went from wealthy club goers down to lower class urban people. And primarily, this was black neighborhoods. So you had this rise in illegal, drug distribution operations organized by gangs like the Bloods and the Crips, who were sort of like best thought of as franchises, is how a lot of these sort of notorious gangs operate. And they made a lot of money. That's part of the reason gangster rap became so prominent in the 90s, is both because of sort of the authenticity of the stories, but also because a lot of these people's music careers, their initial recordings, were funded by these suddenly wealthy Crips and Bloods who were trying to, when there's a lot of illicit money, moving it into legitimate enterprises is a really common practice. It's common today, right? There was a whole host of rappers coming out of Chicago who were deeply affiliated with the Chicago gangs, were. And so you end up, this is a really common move to go from illicit drugs to promoting and founding record labels and producing records in order to make that income more legitimate. Now, all that said, right, this is just a time of vast inequality, sure, and it's some of the highest rates of violent crime the U.S. has seen in a long time. In fact, since the 90s, violent crime has largely been on the decline. It's a fraction of what it was in this era. But in this era, it was significant.
And after shaking up the hornet's nest one too many times, his home was ambushed by the Hilltop Crips gang. But not before he invited 15 of his Ranger buddies over for a barbecue. 300 rounds, and 10 minutes later, the Crips were fighting for their lives.
Oh, well, that seems like it. Interesting. Okay.
In 1989, the neighborhood of Ash Street in Tacoma, Washington was an open-air drug market. There were several hotspots and almost every house on the block was an active and thriving trap house. These gang infestations in the 1980s, born from the crack epidemic, flooded the streets and created an economic downturn that defined the decade. You might remember President Ronald Reagan declaring the war on drugs, or his first lady who was just like, just say no, oh my god. That was this time. Tacoma was Washington State's ground zero of gang activity, and by the summer of 1989, it had grown blatant, middle of the day.
So here's the thing also to remember about military bases. Military bases, or army bases specifically, are almost always located in land the government couldn't sell profitably to anyone, right? If the land was worth anything at any point in history, they would have sold it to a private developer, a rancher, a miner, anyone, literally anyone that would have written them a check. That means that they built military bases on land that was so desolate, so isolated, or in the case of Tacoma, Washington, so incredibly impoverished that no one wanted to be there. So at this time, it was Fort Lewis. It's now called Joint Base Lewis-McChord because they combined it with McChord Air Force Base. But Fort Lewis was the home of one of the battalions of 75th Ranger Regiment, 3rd Bat, maybe? Let me know in the comments if I got that right. Maybe 1st Bat. Anyway, doesn't matter. Point is, it's a large army base located in an area that's terrible. And you may ask yourself, why would you buy a house in Crip country? Well, the reason is because oftentimes when you're an active duty soldier, that's all you can afford. And again, imagine if you were in the greater Seattle Tacoma area and you purchased homes in what are now, right, extremely valuable areas. Right? This house, if you purchased it in the 90s, here you are 30 years later, you're at the tail end or you've retired from your military career, you've been renting the house this whole time, and it's worth $750,000, which is completely realistic. But you have to grind it out. You have to wait through the bad times like this. The other reason is because if you're a military service member, you know exactly where to find your tenants, the military base. So it's an incredibly simple and easy system if you can work it, right? You buy a house, you live there for 4 years, then you move when you get reassigned by the military and you rent it out to other military members, letting the house appreciate over time. And if you're a military member, your pay can actually afford that house. Unlike, say, if you were to if you were an enlisted soldier and you moved to Washington, D.C., you won't be able to afford any housing in the greater metro area. There's just too much competition.
Type shit. Like selling crack to the ice cream man type shit. And this was all fueled by an influx of gang members moving in from California. Tacoma police had experienced nothing like it before and were really struggling to get it under control, oftentimes not even knowing how to respond to it. Ash Street neighbors consistently called police and called 911 repeatedly and got nowhere. The typical response from police at the time was very mild. Community-oriented policing was a new thing, such as taking bullshit calls and pretending like it's not bullshit.
Yes, ma'am. I know you can't sleep when the dogs are barking.
But community policing was still viewed with suspicion by veteran cops who came up in the 60s and preferred the old ways, like smacking people in the head with their portable radios. At the time, Tacoma Police Chief Ray Fatelin pushed these new community policing programs so far that the Hilltop Crip Gang rose to power.
All right, so this is sort of a thesis that community policing community policing is traditionally what's sometimes called the broken windows fallacy. And it's it's associated. I misspoke. Community policing is the idea that basically crime is a product of its environment. And if you allow tiny crimes to be perpetrated in the environment, say breaking a window or jumping a turnstile, then it creates an environment in which larger, more serious lawlessness is also permitted. So the thesis is that by preventing petty crimes, you can prevent larger crimes from ever occurring. The data on this is limited. At the time, though, there was good data that made it look like communities that introduced it experienced a subsequent drop in violent crime. Now, it may be because they were arresting, if you are someone who's dealing crack cocaine, jumping a turnstile to get to the subways is probably not that big a worry for you in terms of what you're doing. Though it should be, because as every lawyer will tell you, commit one crime at a time. So it's possible that some of these were actually catching more serious criminals in less offensive ways. But some of it may have just been the natural ebb and flow of the crime rate over time. And people mistakenly believed that it was community policing that did it. But community policing also had another component. And that component was, well, the community. And the idea is that police officers would get to know their community on a personal level. They would talk to neighbors, talk to kids, talk to the individuals that lived in that community to understand their wants and needs, because that's going to help them identify what petty crimes are most contributing to the environment of lawlessness. So that was the thesis. Community policing, again, is pretty pervasive at this point, though a lot of people have pointed out that when you target petty crimes, oftentimes all you're doing is harassing petty criminals. Think about yourself speeding or driving without your updated registration, or jaywalking, or literally a 19-year-old college kid who forgets his Metro card and jumps the turnstile. Have you made the environment safer? Is it worth it to bring these people into the Byzantine judicial system? I can't even talk today. These are the flaws of community policing, is that it biases itself towards a little bit of over policing, of criminalizing just the routine sort of rule breaking that is best dealt with by doing things like, say, ordering someone to get back away from the turnstile and to pay, or just to design a turnstile that's harder to jump.
HTC, when we mounted up the streets 200 deep, and the Park Rangers had a shootout with cats from Ashby. When the Ashby's connected with them hilltop niggas.
Oh, I think I'm turning this down because it's copyrighted.
Foulk of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, purchased his home on Ash Street in hopes that the neighborhood would soon turn around. To protect that investment, he was determined to help push the drugs and gangs out by any means necessary. Which may seem crazy to most people, but Staff Sergeant Foulk was not most people. He was an elite operator who at a moment's notice could hit hard and smash fucking everything. You know, Ranger shit. But violence was the last thing the Staff Sergeant wanted, and he remained optimistic. In the summer of 1989, Foulk returned from a December deployment in Panama to find the neighborhood worse than when he left. Along with other neighbors.
Okay, he mentions a deployment to Panama. It's worth noting that so Panama at the time was home of the military's Jungle Training Center, I think. Let me make sure I don't have this confused with the Panama War, 1989, Panama invasion. Nope, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. We invaded Panama, then turned it into the Jungle Training Center. Yeah, we invaded Panama. So that was a capital D deployment. The Rangers in that, I believe, seized, I want to say the Panama City airfield in Panama City, or the Panama City airport, or a big military airfield. But the Ranger Battalion at the time was absolutely in direct action and in direct conflict with the Panamanian military. So it was not a Kuwait deployment where he was hanging out in the DFAC and taking mandatory training classes in a shell. It wasn't even a deployment to Panama in the mid-90s where you would have gone and you would have done a jungle warfare rotation where you just sort of did exercises in the jungle, learned how to operate there, and then flew home. This was serious combat business that he had just come back from.
Neighbors who were honest, hardworking people, he formed a neighborhood group that pressed police, demanding action. The neighbors started making signs, protesting, and taking pictures of the drug dealers. Even as the tension on Ash Street rose, Chief Fatelin made a decision he would later regret. Hamstrung by budget constraints and desperately short on the patrol side, he shifted 4 of 6 officers away from the Hilltop Crime Management Team to launch a community policing pilot project. The neighbors on Ash Street reacted with dismay. Under fire from citizens and the city council, a local Tribune covered the controversy, noting efforts by Ash Street neighbors to monitor the drug activity themselves. After the News Tribune piece, drug traffic on Ash Street slowed, but only so much. Staff Sergeant Foulk was used to seeing more than 100 cars pass through his block on any given day, and after the story appeared, it was down to 20 cars. Foulk just...
So, yeah, this is actually probably close to the right answer if you have something like this. you can see this guy, Popo Medic, he has a real disdain for community policing. And the truth is, right now, it seems like almost everyone does, for the reasons I talked about, right? On the left, it's viewed as something that encourages policing behaviors that are better dealt with through someone other than an armed cop. Again, turnstile jumpers should maybe just have their Metro card taken away and make them buy a new one, or just design a better turnstile that isn't so jumpable. Jaywalking, you could have a parking enforcement person yell at you, or maybe just have cars not drive like such pricks, right? Or install a stoplight or a crosswalk. So those sort of things become criminalizing non-criminal behaviors. On the right, it's viewed often as a sort of touchy-feely type of police work when the community, despite decades of community policing, the police have never been viewed less favorably by the communities they work in. So the police go, well, this has been a complete waste of our time when we should be relying on intelligence, careful tracking of crime activities, targeting our enforcement efforts to hit the most dangerous criminals where they operate and when they operate. So again, almost no one is a fan of community policing anymore.
Decided to install a video camera in his upstairs window to record the traffic. He organized a neighborhood barbecue as a show of public unity set for 3 p.m. Saturday, September 23rd. He invited neighbors, friends, ranger buddies, and thought nothing more of it. The day of the barbecue, a group of Hilltop Crip gangbangers acknowledged Foulk outside of his residence and gave him the gun finger. It came from a car full of Crips. Driving by his house, the index finger pointed, thumb up, a little flip of the hand, and the mouthed words, boom, boom.
Yeah, I mean, I got to give him credit, man. This is great editing, and it's not complicated editing. But good writing, solid, clean editing can really make for some high drama stuff. I really am into it.
The gangsters saw the video camera on Foulk's house, and a few hours later they returned and threw rocks at it. Someone else took shots at the house and the video camera with a BB gun. Foulk and a few ranger buddies then walked across the street to confront the out-of-shape, chain-smoking gangbangers who think they're hard. Foulk told them to stop.
Nah, it's the Island Boys. Oh man, those guys are so deluded.
Stop throwing things at his home and the neighbors' homes, to stop shooting BBs, and to instead turn their lives around and find better ways. The gangbangers warned him to take the camera out of his window. The gangbangers suggested the staff sergeant didn't know who he was dealing with. The staff sergeant suggested the gangbangers didn't know who they were dealing with. They then told him, "Your history, bitch," and told him they were going to burn his house down and light him up as soon as the sun goes down. Foulk decided to walk away, and before he returned to his home, he overheard one of the Crips stating, "I'm gonna shoot that army son of a bitch." Foulk then walked inside his house. He picked up his telephone, called some more of his ranger buddies from the 2nd Ranger Battalion, and invited them over for a barbecue, suggesting it wouldn't hurt if they came armed. Translation, bring your own bullets. Hey guys, let's have a barbecue. Okay, well, yeah, what are we gonna smoke? Just some Crips.
I mean, you got a right to self-defense. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. I am not a lawyer. I do not know how the law would check out on this. But here's the problem. And this is a society. This is a problem in human societies. Authorities are only as most of what a governing authority does is relies on trust. The truth is that you have a tax collector and but most of those taxes are paid because people want to avoid a visit from the tax collector. They fear that if they don't pay their taxes properly, that the government authority will come and take it from them, ultimately by force if necessary. And this is true of a lot of crime. A lot of crime isn't committed because it's morally wrong. I don't kill my neighbors because why would I? It's wrong. They've done nothing. They don't bother me. I would stand to gain anything, and I'm not a monster, right? And that's true of most of us. But there's a lot of crimes, again, where at some point you just have to recognize that the government's authority is what stops you from doing it. And when the government sort of abdicates its own authority to enforce the rules in the country that they're in charge of, or the area they're in charge of, then it becomes a very dangerous game. You have vigilantism, you have open rebellion, you have, and this is, I'm not talking about, don't apply this to any current country. I'm talking about looking back to the Ottomans, the Romans, ancient Greece. I mean, again, it's governments rely mostly on the perception of their authority and less so on the actual authority they possess. And so once people believe that that authority won't be exercised, then they're not going to voluntarily submit to it. Again, if you don't believe that the police will show up and help you when the Crips are threatening you, or when anyone's threatening you, an abusive ex, then your only option, right? The government had abdicated their authority to protect you. So the only options are to take care of yourself. And that can look all kinds of ways, but it's a really worrying trend because it tends to portend a government's total failure. Because again, if you don't think the government can get to your, can stop an armed group from, invading your house, one, you're going to cast your lot and your loyalty to an armed group that can protect you. And more importantly, you're not going to recognize the other facets of governing authority, like paying your taxes. And once a government doesn't have any resources to govern with, it sort of ceases to function.
Including the few Rangers who were already at the barbecue and the Rangers called, the total of Rangers grew to 15. Foulk told them to bring personal weapons and whatever else they had. They came armed to the teeth with handguns, shotguns, and rifles. Foulk was armed with a Browning 9mm and a Colt Python 357 Magnum. Fucking Magnum. Who's the gangster now, bitch? Over a couple beers, Foulk pitched to his buddies a defensive operation of his home. Stake out locations and wait, no first moves. If police come, disarm immediately, cooperate, and assist. And all of his buddies joyfully agreed and were fucking down. They thought maybe nothing will happen, but if it does, zero tolerance for dudes shooting gats and smoking Swisher Sweets. As the sun went down, the Rangers dispersed into their defensive positions, alert and observant of any and all activity inside and outside the perimeter of the house. A few hours had passed as the
Hint, if you think there's a chance you're going to get into a firefight, don't knock back a brewski. In fact, as a rule, don't touch a firearm after you've been drinking on the same day, period. You have a beer at lunch, cancel your shooting range for the day. Why? Because one, you don't want your inhibition, you don't want your inhibitions to be lowered by being around a firearm. And that could be something, right? You're not going to, even if you don't think you're going to do something stupid, would you let somebody hold it who maybe shouldn't, right? Maybe you're going to forget to clear it, or you're just not going to check the safety that one time. All it takes is a small mistake with firearms to get hurt. And if you have a proper respect for their potency and power, then you're going to know that alcohol and firearms, don't mix. Don't. The same day, you shouldn't. Go shoot at the range, then have a beer. Don't mix and match. And people do it all the time, right? But they shouldn't. And it's stupid. And when you see, here's a hint, guys. If you see a news story in which someone's gun goes off while they're cleaning it and they shoot themselves, it's not because they went off when they were cleaning it. You'd have to be blind to not notice your gun is loaded when you're trying to clean it. Goes off when you're cleaning it because you're fucking playing cowboy. And almost always, it's late at night after beers. I'm just telling you, look at the stories. People cleaning their guns at 12:30 at night. Yeah, no, dude, you played cowboy and you were drunk as shit.
The Rangers held their positions. One Ranger observed a vehicle approaching in the distance at a slow rate of speed, at which point the vehicle shut off its headlights. Foulk, with his Magnum in hand, returned the favor and turned out the lights in his house and in the yard. At 9:20 p.m., as the vehicle approached,
That's pretty crafty. And I want to point this out. That is a sort of it's what's sometimes called signaling. And this is how standoffs often look, right? Those guys may see the house lights turn on and off, and it's just a way of saying, you think I don't see you, I see you. You think you're sneaking up on me? No, I'm waiting for you. And that sort of messaging can be really powerful. I've definitely used it. When I was deployed at one point, we were sort of in a standoff with, at the time, individuals who were armed and arraying themselves in what looked like a support by fire position to attack us. But the rules of engagement said you can't shoot them just because they have guns and they're preparing to attack you. I know. So what we did is we just gave them a little wink and a nod, right? We would shoot flares, mortar flares, directly over their heads, and actually would have the mortar round drift across their support by fire position. And that was our way of signaling to them, we have your position dialed in. So as soon as you try something, these flares are not going to be glowing. They're just going to be exploding. We also, and this was sort of a troll, after dark, had a drone fly as low as it legally could so that they could hear that there was air support on station. They didn't know that it wasn't armed, but as a precautionary measure, that scared them off. It was very, very, very good.
Someone within the vehicle fired a shot into the air. The house was now taking fire from the rear, where, according to police reports, small caliber automatic gunfire was heard. The Rangers opened a shit ton of fire, but so did the Hilltop Crips. One of the Rangers, William Edwards, was posted on the front porch. When the shooting started, he hit the ground as a bullet slammed into the wall beside him. He and other Rangers returned fire, seeing figures running amongst parked cars on the other side of the street. Ranger Russell Nolte, posted in the backyard, crawled forward as a shot hit the back of the house 3 feet over his head. Ranger Burr Settles was posted upstairs by the infamous controversial fucking video camera as a shot came through the window. The bullet grazed his head and he received multiple lacerations on his face from the shattered glass. Numerous muzzle flashes were now seen.
This is one of the reasons why people get so worked up about eye protection. That would be a really dumb reason to lose your Army career because you lost sight in one of your eyes because of shattered glass because of some dumb Crip.
From the east. There were at least 16 shooters in 3 different locations. The Rangers again returned fire, while outside the assailants took cover amongst the parked cars, shooting over their shoulders, ducking down, shooting blindly. You know, stupid shit like that, like gangsters do. At this time, a neighbor taking cover on her kitchen floor dialed 911.
Yeah, what's interesting, again, is the difference between a suppressed and unsuppressed enemy. He talks about it like, and it is sort of amateur hour, right? But it's illustrative of a really true point, which is if you can achieve even a limited degree of suppressive fire, your enemy's lethality drops by so much compared to them shooting against an unobstructed target. Again, these are guys who in drive-bys are highly lethal when they are not being shot, when there's no return fire. As soon as there's return fire, the lethality plummets.
And just like the famous Wild West shootout at the OK Corral, it was over in minutes. 10 minutes, to be exact. The first police car came down the middle of the street, cherries and berries on, with his siren blaring. The Rangers dropped their weapons, but as that first patrol car arrived on scene, one of the Hilltop Crip gang members popped a round off, sending the patrol car reversing out of the scene so quickly, smoke was seen coming from the rear tires. Officers in the car reported hearing 50 to 60 shots in less than 1 minute. Shortly after, more cops pulled into the block, and the gangbangers ran.
Some caught and detained. Oh, good. This is one of the things that sort of people, that people believe that could work in community policing, and that is maybe these guys would have gotten caught at some point prior. But here's the thing. Like, they had all the evidence that this stuff was happening. It just took them being goaded into severe violence for the police to take action. And this is sort of the gripe people have about community policing in general, is that, well, a lot of times these do nothing, it still results in do nothing action because there's so many calls about nonsense that that the police are unable to distinguish nonsense from substance, and to not be able to distinguish, hey, an open air drug market as opposed to the dogs are barking and I can't sleep.
The unarmed staff sergeant walked out the back door to his driveway and the alley behind his house. He felt someone behind and didn't fight. A hand shoved his head down and a voice ordered him to the ground. One gang member by the name of Frankie Strickland was cornered by a police canine and found to be in possession of 16 rounds of 9mm. He said he was holding them for a friend but couldn't remember the friend's name. Like a fucking liar. He also said the same thing about the pistol he was carrying. It was for a friend. Another suspect was carrying copper-headed rounds for a gas gun. Once the situation was under control and the officers learned about the Rangers' defensive operation, the responding sergeant of the Tacoma Police Department wasn't too happy about it. He lectured Foulk and the other Rangers for not calling the police for assistance until shots were fired, and felt that the situation may have been avoided by calling 911 prior to the shooting getting started. Out of what was quite possibly a 35-man gunfight with over 300 rounds shot in the dark, no one was reported to be killed or injured. For 20 years, the official version of the shootout held that miraculously no one was hurt, but there were rumors injured gang members did not seek medical attention for obvious reasons, and some may have even been mortally wounded. And according to Foulk himself, during the firefight, one gang member rushed towards Foulk's house. I guess he thought he was gonna John Wayne it, Foulk remembered. One of the Rangers took aim and hit the gangster in the shoulder. The attacker staggered back and ran away. The moment goes unmentioned in police reports and witness accounts of the time. Unverified gossip holds that the wounded man was treated at a Seattle area hospital, over an hour away from Tacoma.
Yeah, that sort of stuff, extremely common in organized crime. I mean, it just is. And here's the weird thing is, like, in the US, there's a huge incentive. So in the 90s, they passed some legislation that said that emergency rooms can never turn away patients, which means that patients who aren't insured, they will go to emergency rooms. But because they are the only place that can't turn away patients, they become the only point of care for everyone who either isn't insured, was engaged in an illegal activity, can't afford the medical bills, doesn't have documentation to be in the United States as a resident. Any reason that you worry about encountering a more regular medical system funnels you into ERs. And it means that ERs are actually incredibly unprofitable to run. They're a massive drain on resources because you have a highly trained ER physician, and when someone comes in and their little kid has an ear infection, something that should be dealt with by their primary care provider, right? Their family doctor. And so you have this ER doc who's prepared to treat, gunshot wounds and people in immense medical crises, and they're getting attention diverted by all this other nonsense. But it means that, again, you can have a lot of people who are on the margins of society go to the ER for their only point of treatment. And this is a great example of that, right? The person is never caught, or they're never identified definitively, and maybe they don't give a name. Maybe they arrive at the ER without any identifying information, and they give their brother's name, their cousin's name, and then they're treated and released, right? And of course, with a fake name or an incorrect address, they're not really going to be tracked down, and the ER can't really check to make sure that they verify their information before treating them. So all in all, it seems like a really likely outcome from that situation.
Doug Sutherland, who was mayor at the time, pondered a declaration of a citywide version of martial law to combat the gang violence that immediately drew national attention. The city of Tacoma found the dollars to add more police officers to their department. Then Governor Booth Gardner even considered sending in the National Guard to Ash Street. The Hilltop Crip gang member who was arrested and found in possession of the 9mm and the pistol, Frankie Strickland, was the only man charged in connection with the shootout. He was convicted of second-degree assault and was later sentenced to 22 months in prison. The military officially considered the incident a matter of self-defense for the off-duty Rangers. On February 9th, 2010, Tacoma police and...
Ooh, 2010, that's 20 years later, lads. That's 20 years later. And yeah, this is bananas. I mean, this is how bad things were in the 90s during the crack cocaine epidemic. And I want to point out that martial law is a really bad idea for a bunch of reasons, but primarily because the military is not trained for this. You'd actually have to jump through a whole bunch of legal loopholes to allow armed military to operate. Now, you could have National Guard operate, as Texas has done by camping out its guard indefinitely at the border, which is probably starting to border on illegal itself, because you can't order your National Guard onto active duty for 3 straight years to sit in the desert when the Border Patrol doesn't really want them there. But that's neither here nor there. What is important, though, is that the military is not trained to do law enforcement. They can't. They don't have the training. Cops are trained to do law enforcement. The military is trained to kick down doors and shoot people in the face. And that's probably not what needs to be done. And doing it to Americans is a really, really, really bad idea. Even though the military tries its absolute best to avoid civilian casualties, it just isn't prepared to comply with U.S. levels of law and jurisdiction.
And FBI launched a major crackdown on the Hilltop Crip gang and charged 32 members with up to 50 crimes, everything from theft to attempted murder and drug sales. A few years back, a Tacoma police officer said something about the shootout. He said it was the single most important incident in Tacoma that caused a change in police policies and practices. Staff Sergeant William Foulk never moved away from Ash Street, and as he predicted, he was never promoted and left the Army in 1993. He still owns the property to this day. Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that subscribe.
Yeah, do hit subscribe, man. That was pretty good. I always like these documentaries, and there's so much military lore like this. I mean, there's, you know, friend of a friend type stories about crazy shit going down in Korea. The biggest war crime ever committed in Afghanistan. No one ever talks about it. It was 12 years ago, and it was bananas. There's so much more military lore out there. Actually, let me know in the comments if you want me to make some lore videos kind of in this style. I think it has a lot of potential. And certainly there's no shortage of weird, crazy military stories. Anyway, guys, thanks so much for watching. If you want me to do some breakdowns of some combat footage that's too spicy for YouTube, you want to come over to Patreon. Thanks to my Lieutenant tier patrons. Link is in the description. I'll see you in the next one.